Hello, and welcome back to Special Ed on Special Ed. I am your host, Dana Jonson, and today I have Dr. Rebecca Jackson with me. Dr. Jackson is a brain health expert and the Chief Programs Officer at Brain Balance, a board-certified cognitive specialist and a Doctor of Chiropractic. With over 15 years of dedicated research and hands-on application in cognitive development, Dr. Jackson has passionately worked towards improving children's and adults' well-being. Beyond her work at Brain Balance, she's continued her studies with extensive postgraduate education in neurodevelopmental disorders, clinical translational research, nutrition, and functional neurology. She is the author of Back on Track, which combines her vast clinical experience with over 1,000 children and adults, and her role as a mom to offer practical guidance aimed at helping individuals of all ages thrive. In Back on Track, she addresses brain issues such as attention, mood, emotions, behaviors, organization, communication, social interactions, learning, and confidence. That's a mouthful, but I love it. Her innovative approach to neuroscience seeks to enlighten and provide tangible solutions to enhance daily lives. So thank you so much for joining me, Rebecca.
Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it.
Of course. Now, before we get started, I have to play my disclaimer because I'm a lawyer. So that's what I do. The information in this podcast is provided for general informational and entertainment purposes only and may not reflect the current law in your jurisdiction at the time you're listening. Nothing in this episode creates an attorney-client relationship, nor is it legal advice. Do not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any information included in or accessible through this episode without seeking appropriate legal or other professional advice on the particular facts and circumstances at issue from a lawyer or service provider licensed in your state, country, or other appropriate licensing jurisdiction. Hi, so welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
There's so much in there. I mean, that intro is very impressive. There's just so much. I'm ready to dive in. But I was hoping we could start with your background. Like, what brought you here? How did we get to Brain Balance and Back on Track? What brought you to this?
I think like so many things in life, I couldn't have landed here had I planned it, but it was just the path that life took me. As you mentioned in my intro, I started my professional career as a chiropractor. I've always really gravitated towards understanding the why behind things. So I'm the one, if I have a headache before I pop the Advil, I'm going to think, have I had enough to eat? Did I have enough sleep? Am I dehydrated? Do I have congestion in my sinuses? I think I was just attracted to that understanding root cause of things and a more natural, holistic approach. That being said, I think there's absolutely a time and place for other interventions and other approaches. To me, it's about the combination of services and options available. So I started life as a chiropractor, and then my husband's job moved us across the country. So I sold my practice at the time that my daughter was born. My plan at that time was to be a stay-at-home mom, and I was really excited to do that. And I quickly found I needed mental engagement and stimulation. I'm a lifelong learner. That's what gives me energy and excitement. As a new mom and my husband was traveling a lot for work, I went back to school. And the more I was learning about the neurology of pediatric development, the more I realized stay-at-home mom really isn't me. I still wanted to be a super hands-on mom, but I was learning information that I just felt driven to apply. And I was attracted to the neurology of pediatric development because I was a young mom. I wanted to understand for my kids, what could I do to optimize their development? I know that, the sand table and the water table and singing songs and playing games were great. I wanted to know why. What was happening in the brain that drives development? And if there were concerns with development, what to do about it? And I'm fortunate my mom was an elementary school psychologist. So as I was learning this information, I would call my mom and say, Mom, what are the schools doing about this? If a child's struggling with attention, how are they changing that? If a child has dyslexia and their eyes aren't tracking properly and their multisensory integration isn't working, what are they doing? And her answer floored me. And it was, we're not. And
yeah, I was going to say, I want to know her answer too.
Yeah. And I have, again, love for our educators. They have such an important, such a tough job. And she just said, we simply don't have the tools. And she felt like she spent her career putting in place modifications and strategies to work around the problem rather than changing the underlying
100%
concern. So that's where I became driven of, I can't wait till my kids are school age to go back to work. if the information is out there and it's not being applied, that needs to change. And so
Right.
that's ultimately what brought me to Brain Balance, is the ability to exercise and improve the brain to help to minimize complications, so that we're not just modifying and working around the challenge. We have the opportunity to change it.
I can totally relate to just about everything you just said. I was also not the stay-at-home mom, but I was in the middle of law school when I had my first child. So it wasn't like a huge option. But I remember being home for 6 months with one of them, and I was like, yep, this is it. That's all I got. I got to get back to school or something. When you talked about the schools, it is so true. And when I was an educator, now as an attorney, we see that because, as you said, they don't have the tools, right? They're not bringing Brain Balance into the public school. I don't even know how they would, right?
Yeah. Oh, I want to. We're going to find a way.
Okay, good. I'm on board. But, I think that these kinds of things are really important for parents to understand and know that they're out there, because they do make a difference and they can really help. And, I always say, when you have a child with any disabilities, you're the one, right? You're the advocate. You're the CEO. You are in charge. Nobody else is going to show up and say, hey, I got a great idea. So I'm so glad to have you here to talk a little bit more about it. Why don't you talk about a little bit about what brought you to Back on Track?
I started writing Back on Track during the pandemic. Again, I was driven, but what was happening during the pandemic is all of a sudden it was just this escalation in concerns parents were having. I feel like the pandemic poured gasoline on the fire. We already have too many kids and adults struggling with attention, anxiety, depression. The list goes on and on. So we already had that in the background. And then the pandemic hit. And what came along with that was a tremendous amount of sustained stress, which is fatiguing on the brain. And a tired brain is more negative and has a harder time functioning. And we were facing massive amounts of change, changing how we work, changing, whether it is school from home, school in person, masks on, masks off. And change is also really stressful and fatiguing for the brain. So there were very real reasons why the brain was having a harder time in kids and adults. And at that time, I was doing a ton of media spots, right? The media was wanting to talk about, how is this impacting our kids? Parents, how do we get through this? How do we support our kids? So I was doing a lot of writing and speaking about what the impact of these changes were having on the near term and long term with kids. It was already on my mind. And then I was getting phone calls from friends from all across the country, from neighbors, from family members saying, why am I seeing this? What do I do about it? And the news was just filled with the negative headlines.
Yeah.
Bigger achievement gaps with disproportionate impact socioeconomically, higher rates of ADHD, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, shortages of ADHD medication because there was such a spike in taking medication as well as newly prescribed medication. I felt like we were just in this storm of negativity and questions and uncertainty. And at that time,
well, and not to mention all the people dying.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, there was just so much.
Yeah, it was not okay.
And no judgment for any of that. Again, everybody was doing what they needed to do in the moment to feel safe, to feel comfortable, to do what was needed in the moment. But we changed how we functioned, and there was a very real impact. And I felt like the conversation was so negative, but where was the solutions? Where was the guidance?
Right.
Where was the path forward? We knew that there was an impact, but there was no guidance in what to do to minimize that. And I say all the time, my goal is always to not be the smartest in the room. I want to surround myself by people far smarter than I am so that I continue to learn and grow. But I got tired sitting back waiting for somebody else to lead the conversation. And so I thought, okay, I don't have all the answers, but I see it in the data at Brain Balance with increased challenges with kids, greater developmental gaps appearing, and hearing it in friends and family. If I've got some ideas, I want to contribute to the hope, to the path forward. And parents need to know that there are options. The brain is malleable. The brain is changeable. You don't ever need to feel stuck as a parent or an adult. You just need to know there's options out there. So even if you feel like you've tried everything in the traditional options and there's still a struggle, there's other things to do and there's other things to try. So I want to equip parents and educators and grandparents and adults with knowledge on what can we do on a daily basis, optimize our current functions, and then what can we do going forward to change them for the future. So that was
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up COVID because, I think we are still, and we will be for years, I think, dealing with the impact and the fallout of that. And if there's a good thing that came out of COVID, I do think it's this awareness of mental health and other issues that really came up for children. And I think there's a combination. I think, yes, the environment and what we're hearing and seeing and experiencing was very negative. I also think children being home with their parents full time gave parents a whole new view of their children, right? It's easy to send your kid out, for 10 hours a day or however long they go to school and after school and all that. And then, you get a smaller glimpse of them. And don't get me wrong, parents are the number one authority on their children. I don't mean that they don't know their kids, but, some parents weren't realizing their kids couldn't read. Some parents didn't realize, their child was suffering from more mental health issues. And, they're good at hiding things from us. So I think the pandemic brought up so many things. And as you were saying, I found that kids came back. The kids who were timid were more timid. The kids who are mean are more mean. And the whole cycle is just not positive. And as you said, our world around us, it's still very, very negative. And I don't know how we're going to get back on track, but I am excited to hear your ideas. I do want to back up a little bit to brain balance. Can you tell me a little bit more about what brain balance does? What do you do there?
Yeah. Brain Balance is a program that's designed to strengthen and improve the brain, strengthen and improve brain connectivity in both kids and adults. So if you back up to childhood, it's all about development. Development has this typical trajectory that's a series of events that starts in utero. And, if you think about a book like What to Expect When You're Expecting, it walks.
I hated that book. I just have to say that out loud.
It's not my favorite either.
It scared me. I was like, you know what? That's it. I'm not reading these books. I'm just going to go through it.
Yeah. But, I think it's interesting because we've got information on week by week in utero, what development looks like, and it continues on and on and on. And if development for whatever reason goes off track at all, it impacts not just that function in the moment, but it impacts development going forward. So at Brain Balance, we're focused on going back and strengthening foundational development because it's foundational development that sets the stage for our executive functions, our sustained attention, our inhibitory control, our emotional regulation. So one of the things that I love about Brain Balance is we're not focused on the symptom, but saying, is there a reason that this is harder for this child or adult than it is for others? So we go back and look at, are there any gaps and holes in foundational development that's making it harder to learn or regulate your mood or emotions or pay attention? So it's a program that's physical and active. I always say we exercise the brain the way you use it in real life. And in real life, if you think about our conversation right now, you and I are watching each other as we talk. We're listening. We're blocking out distractions. We're using working memory to think about what we're saying and move to the next point. Our brain has to be able to synthesize vast amount of information instantly in order to react in the appropriate way. That takes a mature brain. So through combination of sensory stimulation, physical activities, eye exercises, cognitive activities, and supported by nutrition, we're here to help mature the brain. And a more mature brain is faster, stronger, more efficient, so that you're more able to block out distractions, pay attention, and perform.
Wow, that's really interesting. So when you talk about that, you're saying physical activities. Can you give me an example of somebody who would come in and they're doing all those things? Are they doing them all at once, or does it depend on the person?
Both. I always say our secret sauce at Brain Balance has nothing to do with any one thing that we're doing. It's the fact that we do it all together. There's this amazing thing in the brain called co-activation, where when you engage multiple regions together, even more areas light up. So it's this multiplier effect. So if you were to do the program, it's personalized to your levels and needs and progresses at your rate and pace, but ultimately you would get to a point where you've got colored glasses that light and flash. You've got tactile stimulation happening. There'd be olfactory stimulation with particular auditory stimulation while you're doing core muscles, balance, rhythm and timing. And then we do a lot with the visual system. The visual system is so complex and fascinating. And if our eyes aren't moving with the speed and accuracy that's age appropriate, it can make things like reading so much more complicated. If your eyes are jumping and skipping and jumping down a line and up, that can hurt comprehension. When comprehension might not be the issue, it might be that you don't have accurate control of eye movements. So it's a combination of the physical, of technology, so games and activities on a tablet, and then cognitive activities, I said that already, combined with the physical, and then all supported by healthy nutrition. So it's a really comprehensive program that's all about optimizing brain health and development.
So with the eyes, is that like the EMDR? Am I saying that right? Where the eye movement that some people use to like get through trauma? Or I don't really understand that, but is it similar to that?
No, different than EMDR, but
Oh, I said
the
it right.
visual, you did. The visual system it's so complex. So we're really looking at speed, accuracy, and endurance for the visual system, for both how you perceive what you're seeing, as well as the control of the eye movements. And because the visual system is so complex, we get a sense. So we use eye tracking technology. And so we have you through a special computerized device that tracks how your eyes move in real time. And so we have you look at a dot to see, do you have gaze control? Do you have the ability to hold your eyes still? That's actually a very difficult thing. And then can you jump your eyes from position to position? And then we have you read in real time, and we get a live playback to show how the eyes are moving. And it's fascinating to see. I can gauge or get a sense of a child or an adult's attentional capabilities by looking at the visual system. If the eyes don't have the appropriate control or endurance, the brain's having to work so much harder throughout the day. And a tired brain is going to have a harder time paying attention. So we're really looking at speed, accuracy, and endurance, and then working to improve that so that brain has more energy to dedicate to other things, and the eyes move and perceive faster and more accurately.
That's so cool. I have a tangent too that I want to ask you, because you said that a lot of this, it starts in utero, right? So all the experiences that a person has from the very beginning contribute to this. What really popped into my head immediately were when children are adopted and they change. And I hear people say, well, they were adopted as an infant, so it doesn't matter. But isn't there something there that like that change or that shift that impacts? Because I have 3 adopted children, so I did not get them as infants, though. But I'm interested in that concept of there are things that happen as an infant. Like my son was in the NICU for 2 months, so there are things that go on, and I think we as adults think, well, they won't remember that because they were infants, but that they actually do impact how they are as adolescents or as adults. Is that accurate, or am I making that up?
No, it is, and it's layers of an onion. There's multiple contributing factors there. So the mother's health and nutrition and sleep and brain health during pregnancy has a huge impact on that developing infant. And so if the mother's under high levels of stress or, drugs and alcohol, there's a toxic impact. The mother's movement, if there's any autoimmune conditions that's driving up systemic inflammation, all of those things can have an impact on that developing baby. Then when you think about, there's some amazing things that happen during pregnancy is you're bonding with that baby before you even know it. Your voice is what they're hearing all day long. You're sharing nutrients. And so, there's some really fascinating studies looking at the mother's sound and smell and how an infant reacts to that right away. And so then when there's change of we're shifting an infant from one primary caregiver to another, that is a initial traumatic experience. And it might be the best possible thing for that child going forward, but there is an impact on that. So absolutely, when there's an adoption or foster care scenario, there are additional considerations of additional factors that will contribute to brain health and development for that child. But to me, then it always goes back to the health and the hope is we know that the brain's able to change, and trauma is real. Trauma has an effect on the brain, and it doesn't matter if you remember it or not. There's a stress response that happens. But we also know through maturing the brain and the appropriate counseling and support services that the brain can be positively impacted. It doesn't ever make the trauma go away, but it still can have a positive impact on that child's development.
I love that you said that even if it's the best option for the child moving forward, because I think we have that misconception too, that when a child's life is then put in a more positive place, like you pick them up and you put them somewhere positive, that suddenly everything should be okay. And it's just not. All of that, even as you said, if they don't remember it, is still in their brain. I remember what got me thinking about this originally was I met a woman who had adopted a child from, I want to say from China as an infant, but she was explaining to me that all the sounds this baby was hearing were different, all the smells that it was experiencing were different, and that was a huge shock to their system. Even again, if it's the best outcome, it still was a huge shock to the baby's system because it just wasn't anything close to what they were used to. And I thought that was so interesting. And again, we hear, well, they don't remember it, or they're too little, or it's a good house, or whatever it is. And that just doesn't solve all the problems. As you said, there's a root issue. And I think as a society, we are really focused on addressing the symptoms, not the core of where that came from.
We are. And, when you think about something as simple as attention, a child that's struggling with attention or behavior, telling them what to do, if practicing attention, if practicing good behavior was going to get you there, you wouldn't need additional services like what I
Right.
do. So,
wouldn't that be great?
Right. The adult that's struggling with, impulse control and emotional regulation and attention, we've been practicing that for a really long time. And so to me, it's not about practicing what you're deficient in. It's going back to say, why is this harder for you? And understanding, when you think about the development of attention, for a 2-year-old, we expect them to play with something for, 30 seconds to 4 minutes and then move on to the next thing. And that is typical healthy development for a 2-year-old. By the time that child matures and is in kindergarten, the developmental expectation is to be able to sit long enough for circle time in the morning to talk about the weather and the calendar and the days of the week and talk about the day. But then not all kids develop equally in all areas of development. So then we've got a 5 or 6-year-old sitting in that classroom that might have some aspects of development right on track and might have other aspects of development behind. And that can look like putting a 3-year-old in a kindergarten classroom and asking them to pay attention as long as their peers, not get frustrated and upset, share toys, apply what they're learning. And all we see as the parents and educators is the child standing in front of us. We don't get to see and understand those nuances of development to know what are the appropriate developmental expectations for that child. And then what can I do to close that developmental gap so I can have age appropriate expectations for that child that can then perform like their peers.
Yeah. And I think with children, it depends on where they are developmentally appropriate or delayed. And at least in my work, I know that if a child can sit still in class and isn't bothering anybody else, they're way less likely to be identified or get services. And that doesn't mean that I always say it's the problem of them not bothering anyone. If they're not bothering somebody else, then they get overlooked because I think in our classrooms now, it's a whole different conversation, but we have way too many kids and all that other stuff. It is tough for an educator to be able to identify those subtle nuances and not recognize what's going on if the child is they may not be paying attention, but they're sitting quietly and they are acting the part, then we can easily miss past those things. And I think that's a real challenge for educators, It
is. And my heart breaks for that child because that child to me is the duck in the water where you see this cute little duck and they're working so hard, underneath the surface. And when we've got a child that is the inattentive ADHD type or struggling with a learning disability, where it maybe isn't loud and disruptive to the classroom and they engage appropriately with their peers and they're, kind and respectful and they can read social cues and nuances. What I hear over and over is parents and educators saying, she's just not trying hard enough. She can apply herself.
Oh, that makes me nuts.
I understand where it's coming from because you have a conversation with this child and this child is bright and intelligent and interesting. And then their work doesn't match the aptitude. Mm-hmm. So then it's easy to say they're lazy. They're not trying hard enough. This is the child that's spending 2 to 3 times longer than their peers on homework and still isn't executing. And then they internalize that. What's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? There is feelings of shame. So then it turns into this, there's a whole
bigger issue that becomes, well, and that's
yeah.
why we see so often that, particularly in girls, sometimes in boys, but more often in girls, when they have issues like that are not addressed, they turn into mental health issues as teens. That's where you get the eating disorders and the cutting and the suicidal ideations. And, it can be incredibly significant to not address something as, I don't want to say simple because nothing's simple, but, something like ADHD that just is presenting in a different way.
Yeah. And, to me, the gender piece is fascinating, and understanding that for so long, research has been focused on males. There's far less research on females. And it's because it was this concept that females are more volatile and it's harder to get accurate research. We're volatile because of hormones, and for very real reason. I share this example all the time, but I was at an international brain injury conference a few years ago in Toronto. And these are, top neuro people in the world that were having a conversation and discussion around concussion. And, up until just recently, concussion hadn't ever been studied in females. And they have recently discovered that for a female, the time of month in your cycle of when a concussion occurs has a huge impact on your symptoms and recovery. So you could have a very mild concussion, but depending on the time of month and your hormone combinations, it could have severe repercussions. We need to look at ADHD and development the same way. We know that often it is quieter and less behavioral related for females, but it's no less impactful. And so it's often then picked up later. And so I think it's important for parents to know, what is it that you're watching for early on? And I bring the conversation so often back to the sensory system. If there is disruption with how you regulate and take in our senses in a child, that might look like a child that doesn't like getting their hands dirty, or is particular with tags and textures, or is a really picky eater. As that child matures, what that looks like in an older child is greater struggles with attention and focus, greater struggles with emotional regulation, greater struggles with executive function. That sensory piece is a really early red flag that brings us information to say, this child is immature in how they're processing this information. What can we do to improve that so that we're starting to minimize these complications before it turns into something bigger and harder to address down the road? So it's always looking at that chain of events.
Right. I don't think anything happens out of the blue, right? I mean, we may think it does, but there's so much behind it, especially, the brain is so fascinating. What do you find you see most at Brain Balance? Like, do you mostly see ADHD kids? Do you see kids on the spectrum? Do you see emotional issues? Is there a realm that you see more of? Or is it, I know disability does not discriminate, but I'm just curious as to what you see.
I'm going to take a step back first and say, one of the things at Brain Balance is we really don't focus on the label. We want to take a fresh look at each child or adult coming in to say, regardless of the label, where objectively are you measuring when it comes to cognition and foundational development? Because the reality is, the person that struggles with attention could have no diagnosis or several diagnoses. Depression impacts attention, anxiety, ADHD, autism, sensory processing. All of those result in an impact negatively on attention. ADHD is not the only thing that's about attention. The number one thing or concern that we see are issues with attention, and how that disrupts and plays out can vary person to person and scenario to scenario. So to me, it's not about looking at the label or the diagnosis. It's, what is your particular combination of strengths and weaknesses in development? We can't help everyone and everything at Brain Balance by any stretch. We're always looking at it through the lens of development. If your development is on track in all areas, then our approach isn't going to get you to where you need to be. And our focus is on maturing and strengthening the brain. If there's a stressful home environment, there's so many other external factors that we're not able to influence. But we look at it to say, are there opportunities in the brain that we can strengthen and improve? But I do want to see that it ties with the parents or adults' concerns. So if you come to me to say, gosh, Rebecca, I'm really struggling with executive function, are you able to help? If I don't see anything in your data that ties to that, then we're not the right answer for as a program. And so we look to the data. It tells a story. And when the data tells a story, then it's the right fit where we see opportunities for improvement. And I feel like I just went on a tangent. So did I answer your question?
No, you did, because I think that's a great answer, because what I'm hearing is a lot of these pieces impact a lot of people regardless of their label, right? That doesn't
Yeah.
mean that, you can have the mental health issue or you can have autism or ADHD or, as you said, sensory processing, and still all of those things will impact the attentional piece. And so that would be the common thread that you're addressing.
Yep. Attention and cognition. And so absolutely, we work with individuals on the spectrum with learning disabilities. It is a broad range,
Right.
but the common denominator is there's gaps in development. And the most common symptoms or concerns that parents are reaching out for in adults. Adults really talk about things more in terms of executive function, even if they're not using those words. So
Right.
struggle with time management. Adults are seeking us out when it's impacting work and relationships. So, maybe I just got a new promotion and the load on me has increased and I can't rise to meet that challenge, or I'm constantly late and I just can't pull it together. That's really what adults are reaching out, asking for help in. It's interesting if we go back to talking about labels, because labels can be helpful. It gives you a frame of context. It gives you a frame of reference. For adults, there's this aha moment of, for the adult that's diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, it can be this relief of like, oh my gosh, suddenly my whole life is making more sense to me. But what we know about ADHD is for the child or adult, that there's parts of the brain that are about 30% behind. And those parts of the brain are all throughout, but it does impact sustained attention, executive function, emotional regulation. It impacts areas all throughout the brain. But then we also know, so if about 10% of the childhood population in the US qualifies for an ADHD diagnosis, there's an additional 17% that are considered sub-threshold ADHD, which means they're falling just shy of the clinical criteria for ADHD, but there's still a challenge and a struggle. So that's where, to me, it's not about the label. It's about, is something making life harder than it needs to be? And it's disrupting and impacting your life. Whether or not there's a diagnosis, there may be an opportunity to minimize that concern or challenge.
And I always say, when we talk about labels, if a child has a hearing impairment or ADHD or auditory processing disorder, they may present the same in the classroom, but how you address them would be different. You're not going to teach a child with ADHD like you would a child who's hearing impaired and get the same results. But that goes back to, we're dealing with the symptoms, right? And so to understand that, and it sounds like, what you guys are doing is going way down and saying, okay, where's the attentional piece, or what piece are we trying to address that isn't lining up? What are the brain balance? Sounds amazing. I wish I was there. Back on track. What are the core principles of back on track? So I know why you got to it, but what are you addressing? I mean, you can't take brain balance home, right? So,
right. And we do have an at-home virtual program, so you can do brain balance from home. So
well,
we work with families all over the world, but and I always say a book is never a replacement for a full comprehensive program. But to me, the purpose of the book is to give parents and adults an aha and an understanding. This is why I'm seeing what I'm seeing. This is real. It's not just in your head. And we get that question for parents all the time. Is it because he's a 6-year-old boy? Is it because, she's a middle schooler? Or is there something more going on? And then it's interesting to me, going back to that conversation about the trajectory of development, and we know what development looks like week by week in utero. We stopped talking about developmental milestones beyond the toddler years. And so I created, each section of the book has what are the developmental milestones from birth to age 18 in these categories that I think are critical for all of us. So not just gross motor and fine motor development, but what does our social development look like from birth to age 18? What does anxiety look like, or how we react to stress and frustrations and upsets? There are age-appropriate reactions for a 10-year-old that's different than a 15-year-old or an 18-year-old. So I wanted to empower parents with, what does healthy development look like across all the ages in the categories of learning, sensory processing, relationships, all these key areas of life. And then so that can allow a parent to see, okay, maybe my child's on track here, here, or here, but help them to identify where some of those gaps in development are that are contributing to complications in other aspects of life, and then what to do about it. how do we start to close those developmental gaps? And I would say the theme of the book is really quite simple. So often it's back to the basics. The brain is enormously complex, but what our brain needs is sleep, movement, sensory stimulation. And so it's empowering families with what can you do at home on a daily basis without fancy gear and equipment? What can you do work into your day in a really purposeful way that is like a, highly specialized exercise regime for the brain and body to drive and improve and change cognition, attention, emotional regulation, executive functions.
Is there any area that when you're looking at the book, what's the hardest thing for someone to do on their own?
That's a good question. I think it's get started.
Yeah.
When I talk with families, sometimes it's having both parents or both caregivers on the same page, and it takes getting started and it takes consistency. There was a quote that I heard the other day that I loved, and it was, I'm going to get it wrong, but the gist of it was, excellence isn't about what you do sometimes, it's what you do all the time, or success is based on what you do all the time. So,
I love that.
If I wanted to lose weight, eating healthy one day a week isn't the answer. And so it's how do we take these concepts and work them into our daily habits and routines? And to me, what's so important about that is my kids aren't always going to be under my roof. Your kids are off in college. I've got kids getting closer to those ages. I need them to have the self-awareness and the knowledge of what does their brain need to be healthy and happy and productive. So when I'm not there to say, hey, you're not getting enough sleep, you're spending way too much time on TikTok, you haven't fueled your brain to perform, or you're having a hard time focusing, and you take 5 minutes and go do some burpees to use your muscles to turn back on your brain. It's empowering our kids and ourselves to have a little bit of control in a world that we have so little control over. What can I do on a daily basis? So I think the hardest parts are getting everybody on the same page, getting started, and then it's changing habits and routines so that it's consistent, so that it truly is impactful down the road.
Yeah, I think I totally hear that. I mean, getting started, well, both of those things, being on the same page, even just getting my husband to read the book sometimes is a little challenging, but it is hard to not be on the same page because then there's that conflict. The kids are not getting consistency, right? If you're not on the same page, even if someone's not actively working against you, but they just might not be in line with what you're trying to implement. And that can be stressful for kids too, because they don't have set expectations, right? So they're guessing a lot of the time.
Yeah. And a comment I hear from parents is, oh, I was that way as a kid and I turned out fine. To me, it's not a matter of did you turn out fine, is life is hard. What can we do to minimize the complications? So it's not a matter of turning out fine. It's could things have been better? What would your life look like? And if you were better with executive functions, if you could pay attention longer, if you didn't lose your cool as often, it's just, again, it's making the brain stronger, faster, more efficient.
Well, that's funny you say that, because when someone says that, like, well, that's what I had to do when I was growing up. I'm like, yeah, but you didn't enjoy that. So why would you then impart that on your children? Like, that was a really tough part of my life, but I made it through. So you do it too. It just doesn't make sense. And, I do think we often have this fear of, I refer to my kids as snowflakes all the time, but of making our children, not tough the way that we are tough, or whatever that is. But I think on one level, for me, I'll speak for me, becoming tough in certain areas was not an option. It had to be because there were struggles that I had, right? That I had to overcome or deal with. If I didn't have those struggles, how much better would my life have been? Or, I'm happy with my life where it is. So I'm not, not saying that, but you know what I mean? I watched my daughter, for example, we both have dyslexia and ADHD. The IDEA wasn't a thing when I went to school. With her, she's been identified since she was in second grade. So it's watching this completely different environment that she's growing up with, learning her strategies and stuff like that. And sometimes I do think like, oh, suck it up, Buttercup. Like, what is that? She's just not tough enough. But at the same time, she has so many more skills and healthier skills than I ever did, that it is going to make her more resilient and more able to face and handle challenges, not just because she can white knuckle it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think for parents, again, this is what I've watched over and over. I think sometimes it's hard to say out loud that there's a struggle or a challenge. And I think it's almost like a parent doesn't want to say that they don't love and accept their child exactly how they are. So we're not here to say there's something broken, there's something wrong. It's again, nutrition and exercise. You can be healthy and you still benefit from eating well and exercising. It's not is something wrong and broken, is can we strengthen something? And would that have a positive benefit on your life? That's a great thing. And
Right.
I think there's also this, there's this conversation around ADHD of ADHD is my superpower or ADHD is ruining my life. It's both and, right?
Right, exactly. It's not or.
It is. And sometimes parents have this fear of, if I work to strengthen or minimize the challenge, am I going to negate the gift and the amazing creativity or the gifts of my child? And
Right.
by strengthening areas of weakness, it doesn't undo pathways or take away from the amazing. It's,
Right.
when a child has or an adult has this split or this dichotomy where some skills and functions are at or above age appropriate and some aren't, that's hard. As a parent, you're going to see volatility and consistency, and it makes it hard to understand because you're like, you did it just fine yesterday. You did your homework and turned it in. Why didn't you today? So now again, I'm going to think, is this behavior? Do you just not care? Are you lazy? When for that child, the star and the sun and the moons need to align in order to do it. And maybe it all aligned that day. They were well rested, well fed, they weren't stressed. And so they were more easily to access the functions to allow them to remember and execute. So parents don't need to worry about strengthening and supporting areas that they have to work harder in. Isn't going to take away from the joy and wonder and gifts that your child has. It, in fact, is going to give them more energy to apply to other areas. So as parents, it's the inner turmoil that we're facing, right? Of
Yes.
How do we love and accept and support our kids and set them up for ultimate success and well-being?
For me, I try to look at it as my children aren't purposely trying to irritate me, right? They're not purposely trying to do much, actually. But, what is the reason? What are they trying to communicate to me by having this fit or by not doing that? Or, looking at it from not taking it personally, right? Not saying this has to do with how you're impacting me, but rather, what is this doing for you? What are you getting out of this behavior or action? And I think that leads you to better answers.
Yeah. And easier said than done, right? And
yeah, 100%. I'm not saying, yes.
It's so much easier to sit here and talk to other people about what to do with their kids than it is to do it with your own.
Exactly.
But, one of the things that's helped me as a parent, just thought process wise, is when there's an upset, it's often we're asking a child or an adult to do something that they don't feel equipped to do. So when we feel overwhelmed, we get stressed and irritable and cranky and we lash out and we melt down, and it looks different at different ages. And so when I start to see one of my kids escalate or have not ideal behavior, it's stepping back and asking the question of what's overwhelming them right now. And sometimes it has everything to do with what you're asking them to do in the moment. And sometimes it has nothing to do with that and has, what's going on in the background of their life that I maybe not seeing. And then from the brain health perspective, it's what can I influence? I can't change the way your friends are behaving. I can't change the homework that your teacher is assigning, but we can make sure, have you eaten? If the brain has run out of fuel, you can't focus, you can't concentrate, right. You can't make decisions. Can we engage the muscles to re-engage attention and memory? Can we help to reduce stress by, I can't make the homework go away, but let's sit down and make a to-do list and put dates and times by it. So let's prioritize that list so that you don't have to do all of this right now. We just have to get through steps 1 and 2 today. So what can we influence to have that overwhelm feel less from that perspective of brain health? What does the brain need to be productive?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Is there I feel like we talked about so much. Did I miss anything? What did we not cover?
I forgot we were even recording a podcast.
I know.
We were just visiting and having a conversation.
I'm so fascinated.
I don't know what we covered and didn't from our original topic outline, but I enjoyed the conversation and hope parents have some nuggets. And I just want to point out too, I say all these things to be clear. I annoy my kids constantly. So I say the things that I want them to hear, but my kids are just as annoyed by me as everybody else's kids. But I hope my voice haunts them. I hope my voice is in the back of their head when they're not in my house and living at home.
I hear you. I absolutely hear you. And, my kids are most of them are in college now, but so they're not fully on their own yet. That's like the halfway part. They're sort of on their own, but not really. And it's definitely like, that's white knuckling it. That's like, okay, did I get anything through to them? And you learn volumes about them as they become adults.
Yeah.
So it is fascinating. But thank you so much for joining me. This was really great. I love brain balance. You did say that you do have an online thing as well.
We do. So we've got over 70 centers all across the US. So you can do the program in person. We also have an at-home virtual program that is still live coached from a brain balance coach through the computer.
Oh,
but you get
wow.
all the gear and technology needed in order to do the program from home. So we work with kids and adults from all over the world.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to have all that information in my show notes. So if you're listening to this on the run, you can go back and check the show notes, and I will have your website as well and the link to the book, because I think this sounds like something that any parent can benefit from, disability or not. And
Yes.
probably some educators as well could use this book in their pocket. So thank you so much for joining me. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Please don't forget to follow this podcast so you don't miss any new episodes, and leave a review when you have a chance. If there's anything you want to hear about or comment on, please go to my Facebook page, Special Ed on Special Ed, and find me there. I'll see you next time here on Special Ed on Special Ed. Have a fabulous day. The views expressed in this episode are those of the speakers at the time of the recording and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company, or even that individual today.